Alright, first let's talk about the phrase this house, or this house believes that. This house means the House of Parliament. So basically, pretend that you are in a Congress, any Congress, but let's just say Parliament. You're saying this house believes, which means this house should believe that whatever the rest of the resolution is. So when you hear this house believes no country should leave the euro in 2011, you probably want to define this house as the EU and then argue as to why no country should leave the euro in 2011. If you receive this house believes that the Federal Reserve should be abolished and we should move to a gold standard, then this house probably shouldn't mean the government of Japan, it should mean the government of the United States. If you have this house, it means we should. Now here's where the problem comes in, is some people say, well, you didn't define this house as, one thing or another, so I get to define it as whatever I want. I define this house as your mom, or I define this house as, the neighbors next door, or Walmart. Debate is really a bit more reasonable than that, but it's always a good idea to define this house. What most Parli debaters do at the national college circuits is they just define this house as the advocacy of the room, which is another way of saying exactly what I explained to you, but honestly that probably doesn't make sense to community judges. What I like to do when I phrase resolutions for tournaments is just take the phrase this house out of it entirely. So I say something like, the United States federal government should do X, Y, or Z. You'll see some of both types of resolutions at a Parli debate. There's no reason that a Parli debate has to say this house believes. It's just that some often do. And that gives you a little more leeway on the government side, usually. Now, let's actually prep some specific resolutions. So we're going to take resolutions that were proposed or have actually been debated in STOA this year. So the first one is, the terrorists have won. What type of resolution is that? It's a fact resolution. The terrorists, X, have subjective word. We're going to have to decide what winning means. So let's first prep the gov side, and then we'll prep the op side really quick, just basic terms. How would you do this? So first of all, you want to say, who are the terrorists? Let's just say it's Al-Qaeda. Or we can say it's radical Islam generally. You have the right to define, you can be pretty fair with this, as long as you're talking about general knowledge that somebody can know. I used to debate Western Kentucky University. They researched the Indochina-Burma region to the nth level of detail, and we're always able to argue really vague stuff that nobody knew about Indochina-Burma, but they often got voted out on topicality or on rules because they weren't talking about something that generally everybody knew. They had specifically, intentionally researched to the nth degree something that nobody would know and tried to squeeze it into every resolution. So let's just say Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda are the terrorists, have won. We need to set up a value structure for determining what one means. So, in this case, I'm just going to say, you can do anything that you want with this. But let's review really quick what a value structure is. Usually you say value or goal, you say what it is, you say its superiority, and this is in not really a particular order, why it's the goal. Probably want to define it, which can mean describe. You don't have to use a dictionary. Everybody should know what it means. And you want to usually give a criteria or a weighing mechanism, which is how you achieve the goal. Okay? In this case, we're deciding, really, what are victory terms for the terrorists? So in this case, I say that victory terms are cost the U.S. I could do anything here. I could say make us be afraid. I actually like that better. Or I could have two goals. I say their goal is make us afraid. And I say the definition, first of all I say its etymology. Terror has to do with fear, and so that's why this is a legitimate interpretation. And then I say that make us afraid means we do irrational things because of fear. So what am I setting up? I'm setting a fair debate round because I'm setting a fair burden on myself to show that we have done some irrational things because of what Al-Qaeda has done. Right? Right. That's good. You don't want to define yourself into a tautology where, of course, the resolution is true, because then it doesn't provide ground for the debate. The criteria or weighing mechanism to get there. I'll say, let's examine, one, if we have spent vast quantities of money combating this fear. And I'll say, I'm not going to write all this out, it means that we've spent more proportionally than the threat is worth. So like in a war we might spend X amount of dollars, but if 2 guys are going to die, we probably shouldn't be spending that same amount of billions and billions of dollars to prevent Russia from invading, for example. Second, I'm going to say that we live in fear. Here, we'll talk about my contentions in a second. And third, I'm going to say we can tell if we are made afraid by compromising our own ideals. Because people who are afraid act in ways that violate their own principles. We become the enemy, so to speak. So then what are my contentions going to be? The rest of my case is about developing contentions. So my first piece of paper is going to be about how much money we've spent fighting terrorism. I'm going to talk about the dollars we've put into Afghanistan and into some of the other places we may have fought terrorism, and into the dollars we put into protecting ourselves from terrorism. So, secure flight, all the things that we do at airports now, ridiculous screening procedures, the billions and billions we've poured into our security industry is what I'm going to be talking about. We've spent more than is warranted by terrorism. So I'm going to talk about how in all of history only so many people have ever even died from terrorism, and it doesn't even stack up close to a real war. Okay, second, I'm going to say we're living in fear. Here I'm going to argue about racial tensions in the United States. I'm going to argue about the effects of that one sniper guy that was driving around Maryland for a while, and I'm probably going to talk about the rhetoric of our time, how terrorism, and 9/11, 9/11, 9/11 are some of the most common types of rhetoric that we see from politicians and from everyday government leaders. And third, I'm going to have a whole contention about how we've compromised our own ideals. I'm going to have the preemption doctrine up here. I'm going to say because they have made us afraid, we're willing to abandon the just war theory and attack a threat before it has materialized, which are the words of the preemption doctrine. I'm going to talk about compromising our own ideals in privacy. I'm going to say that we have allowed NSA to tap more things than it should, and we're allowing the government into more parts of our lives, and cameras on street corners in Chicago. There's something like 1,000, 10,000. There's a bunch. Obviously we're gonna research this because we have computers and stuff. And then I'm going to show that we have compromised our own ideals, and then I'm going to be done. So I'm going to have 3 contentions that match my criteria and weighing mechanism for determining whether they've made us afraid, which I have defined Al-Qaeda as making us afraid as what the resolution means. Fair enough? Okay, if I'm opposition, I don't know what their case is. You can probably guess it's something along those lines. It pretty clearly is talking about, what kind of victory, what is the government team going to have to do? They're going to have to talk about some victory terms besides getting their butts kicked in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iraq. So what's another way they could have won? Because they're obviously not winning militarily or geographically. By fear in our hearts, by making us spend tons of money, or compromising our values. So I think you could pretty clearly prep against each of those positions. I won't go into detail how you would do that. You would just prep a position on one, the other, then the other. You'd also prep some topicality arguments. Terrorists. The terrorists ought to be a large group of terrorists. It shouldn't be, the Caucasus Emirates, for example. I would prep that as a topicality press. Just a quick interpretation. I would press have won as have achieved victory, which does not equal in the process of achieving victory. I think that's going to be a key argument for any team, because it's going to be very difficult for the government to show that the terrorists, whatever they identify, have actually won and are in the process of winning. Do you see? You think that kind of argument up, and then you're going to go into the round with some strong ground. For that one, even though it's a topicality argument, I say put several examples So you want to think up examples of process versus victory, and what those two things both look like in history, so that you can tell when we're still fighting or when the war is over. And I think that you're going to come up with a pretty powerful topicality press. Does that make sense? I hope so. Let's move to another type of example. How about the USFG, which means U.S. federal government, should legalize marijuana? I said I was going to talk about STOA resolutions. That's actually a possibility. I've seen it proposed, so I guess I am. I don't think it's actually happened at a tournament yet. So this kind of resolution is a policy resolution because the United States federal government, a specific actor, should do something. The whole debate round is just going to be your normal policy type debate round. So for you LDers, you probably want to show, here's what's going on in the status quo. It's illegal, and here's what it's causing. Let's just say you call them harms. It is causing a black market, which leads to higher expense of drugs. It leads to mafia. It leads to gangs, and it leads to violence. You want to have examples here. Talk about MS-13. Talk about mafia that they busted in New York City, and so on. And then you're going to offer a plan. You want to specify exactly how they legalize marijuana. See, if I got this resolution, I would say it would be really dumb of me to come up here and argue that marijuana should be legalized, especially in a homeschool league. I should be arguing that the United States federal government should legalize marijuana. Do you see the difference? I am going to try to link out of disadvantages that my opponents bring up by saying this is not about whether or not marijuana should be legal or not. It's about we should have different policies in different states, and the states should be the ones who decide whether or not marijuana is illegal, not the federal government. So guess what? I suddenly get to have federalism arguments on my side. So I'm going to have advantage 1, federalism. I can go for a long time developing that. Advantage 2, I'm going to have as breaking down crime. So I'll say less crime. I'm going to explain that for a while. Advantage 3, I'm going to say more freedom. If marijuana is legalized, people have the freedom to hurt themselves. I'm going to say that that leads to responsibility. When the government takes charge, then slowly we start to rely on them to tell it be our moral authority. And I'm going to argue that de Tocqueville says that the mores of our society are what keep us together, and that democracy is not possible without a moral people. When the government, being democratic, tries to legislate morality, then you end up with people who aren't really exercising their freedom responsibly. They're relying on what the government tells them. So they lose personal responsibility, and that ultimately results in a cycle of the government and the people's society going down the toilet. So I think that's enough to get started, but you kind of see how you can play a little bit with a seemingly tough resolution. Now, if you're on the other side, whoops, now we're legalizing marriage. If you're on the op side of legalizing marijuana, what do you want to do? You want to prep disadvantages. So you're going to prep a DA on children. You're going to prep a DA on I'm trying to think of a way to say dangerous stuff, like, people who are driving under the influence. Let's just say under the influence. And then let's say, on the children one, I'm going to use cigarettes as a great example. Let's have a disadvantage about increasing the dependence of foreign cultures on drug manufacture, which is always a bad thing. I'm just going to write other countries here. Because now we have going to increase the demand for marijuana in the United States substantially, and we're probably going to get that elsewhere. So other countries turn from legitimate industry to bad industry. I'll probably make that a domestic claim as well, that the United States markets, farmers will see this as a cash crop and will therefore pursue marijuana instead of whatever other crops that they're producing.